Hello and welcome to this short revision video on types of experiment in psychology. We're going to be looking at the four main types of experiment that you need to know for your exams. Just as a brief overview, when we're talking about experiments, we're talking about the ways in which psychologists try and establish cause and effect in their research. Generally, in an experiment, you have two variables. The independent variable is the one that you manipulate, the one that you change. That then becomes the cause. And the dependent variable is the thing that will change because of that. And that'll be the thing that you measure. And in this case, would become the effect. Okay, the first type of experiment that you need to know are laboratory experiments or lab experiments. These take place under highly controlled conditions. It doesn't have to be a lab, anywhere where you can control extraneous variables. In terms of key terms, you need to know that lab experiments use standardized procedures where participants are randomly allocated to the conditions of the IV. So when you do an experiment, generally speaking, you will have two conditions of the independent variable, such as noise or no noise, or a distraction or no distraction, something like that. And you would randomly allocate who gets into which condition. Classic examples of lab experiments we've looked at, things like Milgram's study on obedience, or Loftus and Palmer's study into eyewitness testimony, or Harlow's experiments on monkeys. Strengths of lab experiments. Because you're using standardized procedures, it means that they're really quite simple to replicate, and this increases the reliability. It also allows for precise control. Control is a key term when we're talking about experiments. Allows us to control the independent variable as well as any other extraneous variables, which means that you're more likely to be able to say that your experiment was measuring what you said it was going to measure, and therefore the internal validity is high. Weaknesses of lab experiments, they tend to be very artificial. Classic example, think Loftus and Palmer. You're watching a video of a car crash. This isn't like watching a car crash in real life, and therefore we say that they have low ecological validity. And this means that it's difficult for us then to generalize the findings to real life settings. Would people in a real car accident be so easily swayed by a leading question? Or would the emotions, etc., that you would have having witnessed a car accident mean that your memory would be better or worse? And finally, lab experiments are highly prone to demand characteristics, again related to their artificial nature. And these can become confounding variables. We're not entirely sure now whether the results that we achieved were down to our IV or were down to people responding to what they believed was required of them. The second type of experiment you need to know are field experiments. These are very similar to lab experiments, except they're done in a real life situation. Crucially, in a field experiment, the experimenter still manipulates an independent variable. They still change something. Examples of field experiments that you may know: Hoefling's study of nurses and social influence, or Bickman, where he was dressed as a security guard or a milkman, or in memory, Johnson and Scott or Loftus's research into anxiety and the weapons focus effect are all examples of field experiments. Generally speaking, field experiments are considered better because they take place in a natural setting and therefore they have higher ecological validity than something done in a lab. And there are less likely to be demand characteristics because, on the whole, in field experiments, certainly in these three examples, people didn't know they were being studied, so therefore they wouldn't be responding to what was expected of them so much. Weaknesses of field experiments. It's very, very hard to control extraneous variables because they're often taking place in everyday situations such as a street or in a hospital, and therefore that also means that they're very, very hard to replicate. They're also more likely to have biased samples because you can't necessarily randomly allocate people to experimental conditions. You're dealing with whoever's around at the time, much more likely to end up with an opportunity sample of whoever was passing on the street or whatever nurses were working that day. And another limitation of field experiments is quite often they are ethically questionable, and that's because you can't get consent before you do them. And people won't obviously have the right to withdraw. They can withdraw their data afterwards once you've explained what was happening, but you can't ask them beforehand whether or not they'd want to take part and let them know that they can withdraw. The third type of experiment, and this is quite often confused, is the natural experiment. Now, in a natural experiment, the experimenter does not manipulate the IV directly. The IV is changing anyway. It's a naturally occurring independent variable. It would still change even if the experimenter wasn't there. In a natural experiment, basically the experimenter is just measuring a DV and waiting for the IV to change on its own. Perhaps the best example I can give you of this would be Rutter's study of Romanian orphans. Obviously, he didn't institutionalize those children. That had happened. He didn't adopt them. Other people did. All of these things were changing naturally. He was just measuring the effect on their cognitive ability and their social abilities. Natural experiments are considered good because there's very few demand characteristics, because this is something that's happening anyway. It's not really a piece of research set up, therefore people aren't responding to what's expected of them, they're just responding to whatever's happening in real life. And it does allow us to study things that would be impossible or unethical to set up. I mean, you couldn't institutionalize a bunch of children to see what impact that had on them. So you just take advantage of that situation when it occurs. The flaws of natural experiments is the complete lack of control. It's very, very difficult to establish cause and effect because you were not controlling the IV or any extraneous variables. These things were all just altering naturally, and therefore at the end it's very difficult for you to say that dependent variable definitely changed because of the amount of time they had in the orphanage, the age at which they were adopted, because there's a whole bunch of other stuff that might happen. And clearly also the reliability of these studies is difficult to ascertain because you can't replicate them unless by a freak event everything that happened happens again in exactly the same way. It would be very, very difficult for you to check the results, and therefore that would also impact on the validity of the research. The final type of experiment you need to know is the sort of experiment, the almost experiment. The quasi experiment is one that looks like an experiment, but the key thing to look out for is that the participants are not randomly allocated. So, you know, a good example is if you're studying locus of control and the effect someone's locus of control would have on whether or not they would respond to social influence, you can set up a lab experiment, but you can't randomly allocate your participants because you either have people with an external locus of control or an internal. And depending on what group they fall into, that will govern which condition they go into. Equally, when you're looking at things like gender, you know, if you're a male, you go into the condition for males. If you're a female, you go into the condition for females. You can't be randomly allocated to those. So these quasi experiments are ones that are done where they look like a lab experiment or a field experiment or whatever type of experiment you're doing, but you can't allocate people to conditions. They are already allocated because of some characteristic they have. In terms of the strengths and weaknesses, they will have the strengths and weaknesses of whatever method they almost are. So a good example is Sheridan and King. If you remember them, they replicated Milgram's experiment with puppies to find out whether or not people would electrocute puppies to death. And what they were looking at was gender. So they had males doing it and females. It has the same strengths and weaknesses of any lab experiment. But obviously the people were not randomly allocated. Okay, so they're your four main types of experiment. You need to be able to spot those. So the key things to look out for is the IV being controlled directly by the researcher? If it is, then the chances are it's a lab or a field experiment. If it's not, then you need to think, is this a naturally occurring IV, or is it something that's inherent to the group, a characteristic of the group, to decide whether it be a natural or a quasi experiment. The other thing to consider is this about whether or not the participants have been allocated. If they have been randomly allocated, the chances are it is a lab experiment, because that's the only one where you can randomly allocate participants to a condition. You need to know these key terms: ecological validity, experimental effects, confounding variables, control, specifically what does control mean in an experiment, demand characteristics, the DV, the IV, extraneous variables, random allocation, and replication. Okay, I will be setting you some questions to do, or a little quiz about this. And if you have any questions, please post them on the classroom. Bye now.